can judge of our case better than we can, but we should conceal all illnesses if we were treated as the Erewhonians are when they have anything the matter with them. We should do the same as with moral and intellectual diseases. We should feign health with the most consummate art, till we are found out, and should hate a single flogging given in the way of mere punishment more than an amputation of a limb, if it were given kindly and courteously performed from a wish to help us out of our difficulty, and with a full consciousness on the part of the doctor that it was only by an accident of constitution that he was not in the like plight himself. So the Erewhonians take a flogging once a week, and a diet of bread and water for 2 or 3 months together, whenever their straightener recommends it. I do not suppose that even my host, on having swindled a confiding widow out of the whole of her property, was put to more actual suffering than a man will readily undergo at the hands of an English doctor. And yet he must have had a very bad time of it. The sounds I heard were sufficient to show that his pain was exquisite, but he never shrank from undergoing it. He was quite sure that it did him good, and I think he was right. I cannot believe that that man will ever embezzle money again. He may, but it will be a long time before he does so. During my confinement in prison, and on my journey, I had already discovered a great deal of the above, but it still seemed surpassingly strange, and I was in constant fear of committing some piece of rudeness, through my inability to look at things from the same standpoint as my neighbours. But after a few weeks' stay with the Nosnibors, I got to understand things better, especially on having heard all about my host's illness, of which he told me fully and repeatedly. It seemed that he had been on the stock exchange of the city for many years, and had amassed enormous wealth without exceeding the limits of what was generally considered justifiable, or at any rate permissible, dealing. But at length on several occasions he had become aware of a desire to make money by fraudulent representations, and had actually dealt with 2 or 3 sums in a way which had made him rather uncomfortable. He had unfortunately made light of it, and pooh-poohed the ailment, until circumstances eventually presented themselves which enabled him to cheat upon a very considerable scale. He told me what they were, and they were about as bad as anything could be, but I need not detail them. He seized the opportunity, and became aware, when it was too late, that he must be seriously out of order. He had neglected himself too long. He drove home at once, broke the news to his wife and daughters as gently as he could, and set off for one of the most celebrated straighteners of the kingdom to a consultation with the family practitioner, for the case was plainly serious. On arrival of the straightener he told his story, and expressed his fear that his morals must be permanently impaired. The eminent man reassured him with a few cheering words, and then proceeded to make a more careful diagnosis of the case. He inquired concerning Mr. Nosnibor's parents. Had their moral health been good? He was answered that there had not been anything seriously amiss with them, but that his maternal grandfather, whom he was supposed to resemble somewhat in person, had been a consummate scoundrel, and had ended his days in a hospital, while a brother of his father's, after having led a most flagitious life for many years, had at last been cured by a philosopher of a new school, which, as far as I could understand it, bore much the same relation to the old as homeopathy to allopathy. The straightener shook his head at this, and laughingly replied that the cure must have been due to nature. After a few more questions, he wrote a prescription and departed. I saw the prescription. It ordered a fine to the state of double the money embezzled, no food but bread and milk for 6 months, and a severe flogging once a month for 12. I was surprised to see that no part of the fine was to be paid to the poor woman whose money had been embezzled, but on inquiry I learned that she would have been prosecuted by the misplaced confidence court if she had not escaped its clutches by dying shortly after she had discovered her loss. As for Mr. Nosnibor, he had received his 11th flogging on the day of my arrival. I saw him later on the same afternoon, and he was still twinged, but there had been no escape from following out the straightener's prescription, for the so-called sanitary laws of Erewhon are very rigorous, and unless the straightener was satisfied that his orders had been obeyed, the patient would have been taken to a hospital, as the poor are, and would have been much worse off. Such at least is the law, but it is never necessary to enforce it. On a subsequent occasion I was present at an interview between Mr. Nosnibor and the family straightener, who was considered competent to watch the completion of the cure. I was struck with the delicacy with which he avoided even the remotest semblance of inquiry after the physical well-being of his patient, though there was a certain yellowness about my host's eyes which argued a bilious habit of body. To have taken notice of this would have been a gross breach of professional etiquette. I was told, however, that a straightener sometimes thinks it right to glance at the possibility of some slight physical disorder if he finds it important in order to assist him in his diagnosis, but the answers which he gets are generally untrue or evasive, and he forms his own conclusions upon the matter as well as he can. Sensible men have been known to say that the straightener should in strict confidence be told of every physical ailment that is likely to bear upon the case, but people are naturally shy of doing this, for they do not like lowering themselves in the opinion of the straightener, and his ignorance of medical science is supreme. I heard of one lady, indeed, who had had the hardihood to confess that a furious outbreak of ill humor and extravagant fancies for which she was seeking advice was possibly the result of indisposition. "You should resist that," said the straightener, in a kind but grave voice. "We can do nothing for the bodies of our patients. Such matters are beyond our province, and I desire that I may hear no further particulars." The lady burst into tears, and promised faithfully that she would never be unwell again. But to return to Mr. Nosnibor. As the afternoon wore on, many carriages drove up with callers to inquire how he had stood his flogging. It had been very severe, but the kind inquiries upon every side gave him great pleasure, and he assured me that he almost felt tempted to do wrong again by the solicitude with which his friends had treated him during his recovery. In this I need hardly say that he was not serious. During the remainder of my stay in the country, Mr. Nosnibor was constantly attentive to his business, and largely increased his already great possessions. But I never heard a whisper to the effect of his having been indisposed a second time, or made money by other than the most strictly honourable means. I did hear afterwards in confidence that there may have been reason to believe that his health had not been a little affected by the straightener's treatment, but his friends did not choose to be over-curious upon the subject, and on his return to his affairs, it was by common consent passed over as hardly criminal in one who was otherwise so much afflicted. For they regard bodily ailments as the more venial in proportion as they have been produced by causes independent of the constitution. Thus, if a person ruin his health by excessive indulgence at the table or by drinking, they count it to be almost a part of the mental disease which brought it about, and so it goes for little. But they have no mercy on such illnesses as fevers or catarrhs or lung diseases, which to us appear to be beyond the control of the individual. They are only more lenient towards the diseases of the young, such as measles, which they think to be like sowing one's wild oats, and look over them as pardonable indiscretions if they have not been too serious, and if they are atoned for by complete subsequent recovery. It is hardly necessary to say that the office of straightener is one which requires long and special training. It stands to reason that he who would cure a moral ailment must be practically acquainted with it in all its bearings. The student for the profession of straightener is required to set apart certain seasons for the practice of each vice in turn, as a religious duty. These seasons are called fasts, and are continued by the student until he finds that he really can subdue all the more usual vices in his own person, and hence can advise his patients from the results of his own experience. Those who intend to be specialists rather than general practitioners devote themselves more particularly to the branch in which their practice will mainly lie. Some students have been obliged to continue their exercises during their whole lives, and some devoted men have actually died as martyrs to the drink, or gluttony, or whatever branch of vice they may have chosen for their especial study. The greater number, however, take no harm by the excursions into the various departments of vice which it is incumbent upon them to study. For the Erewhonians hold that unalloyed virtue is not a thing to be immoderately indulged in. I was shown more than one case in which the real or supposed virtues of parents were visited upon the children to that third and fourth generation. The straighteners say that the most that can be truly said for virtue is that there is a considerable balance in its favor, and that it is, on the whole, a good deal better to be on its side than against it. But they urge that there is much pseudo-virtue going about, which is apt to let people in very badly before they find it out. Those men, they say, are best who are not remarkable either for vice or virtue. I told them about Hogarth's idle and industrious apprentices, but they did not seem to think that the industrious apprentice was a very nice person. End of Chapter 10. Recording by James Christopher, jxchristopher@yahoo.com.